The Milgram Experiment. 1961. Yale University. An ordinary man sat down in a chair. In front of him was a panel of buttons. The researchers told him, "Just keep pressing." And that man kept pressing the button until the person on the other end felt pain. Stanley Milgram wanted to ask a simple question. World War II had just ended. And he wondered, could ordinary people really harm others when given orders? The participants thought this was a simple memory study, but in reality, they were the experiment itself. There was a man in the next room. A system had been set up where he received an electric shock every time he answered a question incorrectly. The experimenter stood beside them in a white lab coat and said, "Keep going. The experiment requires it." Sounds began coming from the other room. First, faint moans, screams. But then, screams filled the air. And finally, an alarm went off. Someone claiming to be having a heart attack. And 65% of the participants continued to press that button up to 450 volts. There was no threat. No weapons. Just a man in a white lab coat and two words, "Keep going." Milgram explained it this way. When a person obeys authority, they transform themselves into that authority's tool. They are no longer responsible. Their conscience falls silent. And at that point, no matter what the worst possible thing might be, they are ready to do it. The Nazis operated this way. Armies operate this way. Corporations operate this way. And perhaps you, without even realizing it, might be operating this way too. When responsibility shifts to someone else, the conscience falls silent. The men who pressed that button weren't monsters. They were teachers, engineers, shopkeepers, neighbors. They were people just like you. The Andes plane crash. October 13th, 1972. A Uruguayan rugby team was heading to Santiago. As the plane flew over the Andes, a pilot error changed everything. The plane crashed into a mountain. The wings broke off. The engine failed. The tail broke off. And it plummeted to the ground from an altitude of 3,600 meters. Only 33 people survived. Rescue teams called off the search 8 days later, and they heard this on the radio. Days passed. Food ran out. The cold was deadly. And on that day, they made a decision. One of the hardest decisions in history. They ate the flesh of their dead friends. What did you feel when you heard that sentence? Disgust? Fear? Judgment? Stop and think. You're in minus 30-degree cold. You can't hunt. You're in the middle of nowhere. You haven't had a single bite to eat in weeks, and your mother, father, or children are waiting for you at home. What would you do in that moment? Years later, one of the survivors, Roberto Canessa, said, "You're eating a dead person, and that person is your friend. But I thought about how my mother would cry when she lost her son. I didn't want my mother to go through that pain." 72 days later, 16 people were rescued. Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa crossed the mountain carrying human flesh in their socks. After a 10-day trek, they came across a shepherd. That's what the instinct for survival is. It comes before everything else. Morality, values, beliefs, friendships. When the brain finds a way to survive, everything that seems right fades away, and only one thing remains. I want to live. And that doesn't make them monsters. Quite the opposite. It makes them human. The Stanford Prison Experiment. A 2-week experiment. Ordinary college students. And a coin toss. Heads, you're a guard. Tails, you're a prisoner. And within 6 days, everything spiraled out of control. Philip Zimbardo wanted to ask a simple question. What shapes human behavior? Is it personality? Or is it the situation you're in? The students were recruited through a newspaper ad. They were all healthy, well-adjusted, normal, and successful young people. None of them had a tendency toward violence. They were randomly divided into 2 groups. The first day was like a game. On the second day, the prisoners revolted. The guards took their beds, they stripped the prisoners. They humiliated them. They incited them against one another. On the third day, a prisoner had a nervous breakdown. He began screaming and crying. He wanted to be released. He was set free. On the 4th day, the guards began waking the prisoners in the middle of the night and making them do meaningless exercises for hours. Because they could. On the 6th day, Zimbardo's fiancée came to visit. She couldn't believe what she saw, because this was no longer an experiment. It had become a real prison. Zimbardo stopped the experiment. The 2-week experiment had ended in 6 days. None of the guards had been sadists beforehand. None of the prisoners had been fragile beforehand. They were simply placed in a role, and that role succeeded in separating them from their true selves. Zimbardo called this the Lucifer effect. When good people are placed in bad situations, the situation changes them. The uniform changes them. The title changes them. Power is like that. It can poison a person. It doesn't really matter whose hands it's in. Wherever power is, violence is there too. The Bystander Effect. March 13th, 1964. Midnight. Queens, New York. 28-year-old Kitty Genovese was walking home from work. A man followed her, he stabbed her, and began to run away. But that wasn't enough for him. He turned back and stabbed her again and again and again. The attack lasted exactly 30 minutes. The New York Times published the story a few days later. The headline read, "38 neighbors watched the murder. No one called the police." This story shook the world, and it changed the history of psychology. But it later turned out that the story was wrong. There weren't 38 people. A few people did call the police. One ran to Kitty's side. The truth was much more complex. But the real question remained, why don't people help? Psychologists John Darley and Biblatane tested this question. And what they found left them in deep shock. The more people there are, the less help comes. They call this the diffusion of responsibility. If there are 10 people around, you think, someone else will handle it. If there are 100 people, you think, someone must have already called. And in the end, no one calls. Years later, during questioning, the killer, Winston Moseley, said, "I knew people wouldn't do anything. People never do." And he was right. A crowd doesn't make you feel safe. Quite the opposite. A crowd dissolves responsibility until it disappears. And while everyone waits for someone else to act, not a single person steps forward. The next time you're in a crowded place and see someone in need of help, and you look around and see no one moving, don't just stand there. If you've watched this far, I'd be really happy if you subscribed. The Jonestown Massacre. November 18th, 1978. Location: the jungles of Guyana. A man leaned into the microphone and said, "Today is the day we die." 918 people listened to him. They gave poison to their children. Then they drank it themselves. Jim Jones founded a small church in Indiana in 1955. He was against racism. He helped the poor. Thousands of people believed in him because he really seemed like a good man. Then everything slowly changed. His followers handed over all their property to the church. Their passports were taken away. They were told to inform on one another. They were summoned to midnight meetings. And Jones told them, "Our enemies want to kill us, but we will act before they do." He repeated this for years. He made them practice for years. He distributed non-toxic drinks and said, "You're all dead." This was a rehearsal. At first, people started crying, but then they began to get used to it. Psychology calls this systematic desensitization. If you throw a frog into boiling water, it will jump out immediately. But if you put the frog in water and heat it up slowly, the frog won't realize it, and it will boil to death. In November 1978, an American congressman visited Jonestown. Some members wanted to escape with him. Jones began to panic, and he had the congressman killed at the airport. And then he broadcast that voice over the microphone. 918 people died. 308 of them were children. Some resisted. But it wasn't enough. Armed guards forced everyone present to drink it. There is an audio recording. Jones's final speech. Children are crying. The voices of mothers can be heard. And Jones is shouting, "Stay calm. This isn't pain. This is freedom." This is how crowds are manipulated. Slowly, step by step. First, love. Then, isolation. Then, fear. And finally, obedience. Unit 731, 1936. Manchuria, China. Japan's most secret facility. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary lumber mill. Inside, however, was a different world. The Japanese army was developing biological weapons here, and for that, they needed people. They kidnapped them from the streets. Chinese civilians, Russian prisoners, women, children, and they gave them a name, Maruta. It means log in Japanese, because to them, they were no longer human. They were merely objects used in experiments. Doctors froze and thawed their arms, over and over again. How many times could they endure it? They were measuring that. Plague, cholera, typhoid. They deliberately infected living people and recorded how they died. They performed surgeries on some without anesthesia. They removed their organs. Then they stitched them up and moved on to another experiment. Between 3,000 and 12,000 people died inside this facility. Outside, over 500,000 Chinese lost their lives to biological attacks. The war ended. Japan surrendered. And what happened to the doctors of Unit 731? America didn't touch them. In fact, they granted them immunity. In exchange, they wanted one thing: research data. Because that data was useful, and those doctors returned to Japan. They taught at universities. They worked in hospitals. They retired. Not a single one was ever prosecuted. But that isn't the darkest psychological question. The darkest question is this: how does a mind that views a human as a log come to be? How does a doctor lie down on the torture table and extend his hand? Dehumanization works like this. First, you get a name. Then that name is erased. A number takes its place. Then a word: log, insect, animal. And from that point on, the conscience falls silent. Stockholm Syndrome. August 23rd, 1973. Stockholm, Sweden. Jan Erik Olsson entered a bank. He drew his gun and took 4 people hostage. It lasted 6 days. For 6 days, those 4 people remained inside a bank vault with an armed man. Finally, the police stormed in. The hostages were released. And then something shocking happened. After the hostages were released, they defended their attackers. They refused to testify against them in court. One of them even got engaged to one of the attackers. The world of psychology was stunned, and a name was given to this phenomenon: Stockholm Syndrome. But the truth is even more intriguing. Years later, hostage Kristen Enmark said, "We weren't afraid of the attacker. We were afraid of the police. The police treated us like nothing. The attacker treated us like human beings." And that explains everything. Under fear, the brain seeks only one thing to survive: a safe connection. Someone who could kill you, but doesn't. Begins to feel like a miracle. Every small act of kindness seems immense. Every human moment feels like a salvation. This isn't a disease. It's the brain's deepest survival mechanism. And it's not just in hostage situations, in abusive relationships, in toxic families, in workplaces under psychological pressure. Why does she still love that man, you ask? Because the brain is protecting you from the wrong person, but it's still protecting you. That's how the Stockholm Syndrome works. It's not about seeing the enemy as a friend, it's about seeking a friend to survive. The little Albert experiment, a 9-month-old baby, and a psychologist. John Watson wanted to ask a simple question: is fear innate, or is it learned? Albert was a healthy, happy, curious baby. He smiled when he saw a white rat. He wanted to touch it. He showed no signs of fear. Watson began the experiment. When Albert reached out to grab the rat, Watson struck a steel rod against the wall behind him, a terrifying sound. Every time Albert was about to touch it, this sound would occur. He repeated this many times, and this sound made Albert cry every single time. After a few trials, Watson brought the rat back. This time there would be no sound. Albert backed away. He cried. He was afraid. The experiment continued. Albert was now afraid of the white rat, but not just the rat. He was also afraid of the white rabbit. He had started to fear all fluffy objects, even a Santa Claus mask. The fear had spread from one object to another. Watson had proven it. Fear is learned. But Watson hadn't done anything. At the start of the experiment, he'd said, "We'll eventually eliminate Albert's fear," but he never tried before leaving. He programmed fear into a baby and left him with that fear. His mother had received $1. Albert died at age 6, and Watson never faced consequences. That's how classical conditioning works. If the brain sees two things together often enough, it links them permanently. Someone who was constantly yelled at as a child might panic in noisy environments. Someone who was abandoned as a child might avoid close relationships. When you look at the root of your fears, you'll likely find a moment like Little Albert's. A sound, a reaction, and everything that changed after that moment.